Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this year's Kim and Judy Davis Dean's Lecture in the Social Sciences, featuring the distinguished columnist and best-selling author, David Brooks. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me acknowledge Kim and Judy Davis, whose support makes this lecture series possible, and I'm very happy to say that Kim Davis is here with us today. Welcome, Kim, and thank you so much. I'm also grateful to members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and to all of our annual donors whose generosity keeps Radcliffe events and exhibitions free and open to the public, and we thank you. Today's program is a part of Radcliffe's initiative on academic freedom and connecting across difference, which launched in 2024. This 5-year effort aims to critically engage both the concept of and unprecedented threats against academic freedom. That is, the rights of universities to determine membership in their communities, and for faculty and students, the freedoms to teach, learn, and conduct research, all without interference, censorship, or retaliation. The initiative also examines how American colleges and universities, including Harvard, have at times fallen short of our ideals. Critiques of higher education have emerged from across the political spectrum and from both within and beyond the academy. The path forward for higher education depends on our capacity both to guard our foundational commitments and to engage thoughtfully with good faith criticisms. In all this work, Radcliffe aims to elevate open inquiry and constructive dialogue across difference. These commitments are fundamental to Radcliffe's mission as an interdisciplinary institute for advanced study, and indeed to higher education as a whole. Free inquiry and respectful exchange, even and especially when we disagree, are vital to educational excellence, to the pursuit of knowledge, and to our democratic society. Our guest today is uniquely positioned to speak to these imperatives. David Brooks has been described as one of the most influential newspaper columnists in America, and he has spent his decades-long career interrogating many of the most consequential subjects of our time, from contested issues in politics and society to the enduring questions of the human condition. David is an esteemed author, analyst, and critic. He's worked at some of the nation's most influential publications, including National Review, Newsweek, The Weekly Standard, The Wall Street Journal, and for the past 22 years, The New York Times, where he's been one of the paper's most prominent opinion writers. David is a newly appointed staff writer at The Atlantic, where he has served as a longtime contributing writer. He's also a frequent contributor to the PBS News Hour, and he's the best-selling author of numerous books, the most recent of which is How to Know a Person: The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. David draws upon a wide range of scholarly disciplines and traditions to explore what he's described as political, social, and cultural trends, the clash of ideas, and the always tricky subject of moral formation. David also has long been a thoughtful champion and critic of higher education, and I'm looking forward to hearing his perspectives at this crucial moment for institutions like ours. In addition to his writing, David is senior advisor at the University of Chicago Leadership and Society Initiative and a presidential senior fellow at the Jackson School of Global Affairs at Yale University, where he's working to foster constructive dialogue and public engagement with the liberal arts. Although I'd like to say that with this lecture, we got him first and once again beat Yale. David has received more than 30 honorary degrees and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has taught at Duke, Yale, and the University of Chicago, and I'm so pleased to David for being here today, and I'm pleased to join him in conversation. In just a moment, I'll welcome David to the stage. We welcome your questions throughout the program. Whether you're watching us in person or online, you can submit your questions at any time using the Slido link that's provided on the screen behind me and posted in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Now, please join me in warmly welcoming David Brooks to the Radcliffe stage.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Didn't Yale win the football game this year?
Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm very excited to have a conversation with you, and we already have so many questions from our audience for you. So let me begin. Now, you write about an extraordinary range of topics, including, as I mentioned, politics, civil society, higher education, and so much more. I thought I'd start by asking you why you decided to become a writer who engages such complex issues, and how your background shaped your trajectory.
I knew I wanted to become a writer super early. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer.
Wow.
And I've really been writing pretty much every day since, except for maybe 200. Even on vacation, I write. I write every morning from 7 in the morning till about 1. And I used to wear a Fitbit, and it thought I was napping. But apparently I was doing what God put me on this earth to do, so my heart rate went down. And so even in high school, I knew I was going to be a writer. It was the center of my identity. I remember I wanted to date this woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She dated some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so those were my values. And my parents were academics.
Yes.
When I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And everybody knows the famous phrase about Chicago, where fun goes to die.
Yes.
My favorite phrase about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so it fit me to a T. I had a double major in Chicago in history and celibacy while I was there, and wrote for the school paper. And one of the things I did, William F. Buckley came to campus, and I was then very much on the left, and I wrote a parody of him for being a name-dropping blowhard. And I can't remember all the jokes. Like, one of the jokes was, while at Yale, Buckley founded 2 magazines, one called the National Buckley and one called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley. And he came to campus, and at the end of his talk to the student body, he said, "David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job."
Wow.
And sadly, I was not in the audience. I was actually, my first TV appearance, I had been hired by PBS as a democratic socialist to debate Milton Friedman.
Oh, wow.
And you can imagine how well that went. And you can go on YouTube to this day, and if you type David Brooks, Milton Friedman, you'll see 21-year-old me, big afro, these 1980s glasses that were apparently on loan from the Mont Palomar Lunar Observatory. And the show was me making some point I'd read, and him destroying it in about 6 seconds, and me sitting there thinking, what do I say? And that was the show. But I eventually called Buckley up and said, "Is that job still open?" He said, "Yeah." Went to work for him. And I wanted to be a novelist and then a playwright. I was a big fan of a guy named Clifford Odets, who was a lefty playwright, and George S. Kaufman. So I wanted to do plays about the revolution with one-liners. And but then I got a job as a police reporter in Chicago. And I came home every day with a story. And it was just very gripping to like, I covered crime, like rapes, murders, horrible things. But it was real life. And so I fell into journalism.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Well, now let's turn to your talk, and I want to unpack the title of your talk, How America Got into This Mess and How We Recover. Now, can you say a little bit about which of the many messes one might identify you mean?
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of messes, but to me, I mean, the one I puzzle over is the weird spiritual, social, relational, you could say even moral crisis. And so you know the rise in depression and suicide, 30% rise in suicide since 2000. The number of people who say they have no friends is up by fourfold since 2000. The number of 36% of Americans say they're persistently lonely. 45% of high school students say they're persistently hopeless and despondent. The number of people not in a romantic relationship is up by a third. The number of people who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50%. And to me, the most significant social statistic concerns social trust. There are two kinds of trust. There's institutional trust. Do you trust government? And through the 20th century, 70% of Americans, up until about 65, said, yeah, I trust government to do the right thing most of the time, 70%. Sometimes as high as 80. And now we're about 19%. And then the other kind of trust, which to me is even more damaging when you lose, is interpersonal trust. Do you trust your neighbors? And it used to be 60% 2 generations ago, and now it's 30%, and about 18% of millennial and Gen Z. The younger you go, the more distrusting people get. And so when you have no social trust, it's very hard to organize community. It's very hard to adjust as a community to a pandemic. People have so now 69% of Americans think we're in decline. 67% think experts don't get people like me. And so there's just been a loss of faith. And some of that is historical, you know, the Iraq War, financial crisis. But some of it is really very personal and intimate. And I think out of that distrust, out of that depression, out of that sadness comes anger. When you feel that nobody sees you, you regard it as an injustice, which it is. And you want to lash out. We evolved to be surrounded by 150 people who are looking out for each other. And so I gave you the sadness statistics. The meanness ones are just as bad. The hate crimes, gun violence. The one that gets me is a generation ago, 2/3 of Americans give to charity every year. And now it's fewer than 50%. So this is, to me, just a social crisis. And I think populism, in part, there are many causes of it, but grows out of this pervasive loss of trust, of faith in the system. And you get this sense from people across the political spectrum, we just got to burn it all down. And so I encounter that opinion wherever I go.
Well, let's talk about how this all applies in higher education. You wrote an influential article in 2024 in The Atlantic where you outlined what you called 6 deadly sins of the meritocracy. Can you briefly walk us through those sins and how higher education fits into your analysis of what's going on in our society now?
Yeah, they gave it the headline, which I did not choose, called How the Ivy League Broke America. And I thought, well, I'll never get invited back to an Ivy League school. But here I am, and I just got hired by Yale, so it's okay. And so the story begins with James Conant, the great president here, who really shifted. He decided that Harvard could not be a school for the sons of Mayflower families. And so he wanted to make it more fair. So he thought intelligence and IQ would be the way to more fairly sort people, and we'll get a natural aristocracy. We'll get people from all around society. It won't just be rich kids. And he shifted the criteria, and it took him a while. But you know, it used to be, even as late as the middle of his term in the 50s, 97% of legacy students were admitted. And it wasn't hard to get in Harvard, as long as your dad went to Harvard. And then he shifted so the SAT scores to get in here went from like 550 to 700 pretty quickly. And to me, that was not a stupid approach. It seemed more fair. But it had some flaws. So I can remind myself of all 6. One, it overrates intelligence. Intelligence is very important. It's probably the single most important factor in predicting a life outcome, but it's not nearly most of what you want to know. And so, for the example, there was a very famous study started in the 1920s called the Terman study out of Stanford. And they took kids not only in the top 1% of IQ, but the top 1.1% of IQ. And they followed them through life. And when they started this study, they thought, these are going to be the future leaders of America. And by and large, they did fine. They became doctors, lawyers, professors. They did well in academic settings. But there were no world beaters. There were no big movie directors. There were no great novelists. There were no major politicians. And so IQ does not measure creativity. IQ does not measure drive. IQ is loosely correlated with good judgment. It does not measure the ability to get along with others. And one of the things that people who really have a high IQ are good at doing is persuading themselves their own false opinions are true. And so it doesn't correlate with a thing they called metacognition, which is thinking about your thinking. So in my view, we ended up with a really bad definition of ability by overly assigning it to IQ. So the second problem was that success in school is not the same as success in life. There's very little correlation between high school and collegiate GPA and life outcomes. High school GPA does predict collegiate GPA, but collegiate GPA does not predict life outcomes. And that's for a pretty obvious reason. One of my students at Yale, I had coffee with her a year out, and she said, when I was at Yale, all of life was station to station. There was the next test, the next thing to apply for, and I got out, and there's no more stations. It's just, she said, it's like I'm in the middle of an ocean with no navigation markers. And so the ability to be self-directed is very different. And the ability to be a good teammate. I mean, grades are pretty individual, but life is mostly about teams. And so somebody did a study where they asked people, when you're fired from a job, why are people fired? In only 11% of cases, it's because they lack the technical ability to do the job. They lost. In 88% of cases, they were bad teammates. They were jerks. They were uncoachable. And so those skills are just tremendously important. And so doing well at a place like Yale, for example, somebody did a study where they took kids from Yale and kids from up and down the US News rankings, and they gave them a bunch of intellectual challenges. And they compared the Yale kids, which is the number 2 school according to the rankings, after Princeton, and the school that happened to rank 150, which is Cleveland State. And the Yale kids were like 1.5% more productive. Not that big a difference. And so we think if you do well and you can get into a place like this, you're going to do well in life. Sorry. The third problem is the game is rigged. That when Conan started this, he thought, well, intelligence is equally distributed. And we'll get all sorts of poor kids rising and succeeding. But it's impossible to separate a genetic trait from the environment it's raised in. And affluent parents became really good at rigging the game. And so Raj Chetty's work, that a kid from the top 1% of earners is 77 times more likely to go to an Ivy League school than a kid from making about $30,000 or $40,000 a year. And there are a lot of elite schools that have more kids from the top 1% of earners' families than the bottom 60%. And this starts early. By preschool, kids whose parents have college degrees are like 5 times more likely to have early childhood education. By 8th grade, they're like 4 grade levels above. By SAT time, they're hundreds of points above. And so parents just invest massively in their kids. And one of my colleagues at Yale, a guy named Daniel Markovitz, who's at the law school, calculated that if you take all the in-kind contributions that affluent parents are pouring into their kids, it amounts to about $10 million over the course of a childhood. Wow. And so it's just a huge advantage. And so you can have all the free tuition you want, but if you're measuring kids by how they do on these metrics, rich kids just have a huge advantage. And so people noticed. And the fourth problem is that we've created an American caste system. That we have this system now, which is divided by income, obviously, but even more pervasively and more worrying to those of us in higher ed, it's divided by education levels. And so people with a high school degree die about 10 or 12 years sooner than people with a college degree. They obviously earn a lot less. They're much less likely to get married. They're much more likely to have opioids. They're much more likely to be obese. They're four times more likely to say they have no friends. They're less likely to go out to parks and to get involved in civic activities. And so you've just got this bifurcation on educational lines. And if you tell generations of people your kids are going to have no shot at the social mobility ladder, well, they're going to flip the table. And to me, global populism is largely the result of a lot of people, especially without college degrees, more working class and rural folks, saying that top 20%, those people have too much cultural power, they have too much financial power, too much political power. It's just too much power in those people. And they look down on me. So Donald Trump's going to be my asshole to get them. And Trump is a weird, understands this. Like the people who are in his administration, it struck me, are they populists? Well, Trump went to Penn, Elon Musk went to Penn, J.D. Vance went to Yale Law, Pete Hegseth went to Princeton, and I think he went here, I can't remember, I can't keep it. Stephen Miller went to Duke. These are the people who went to elite schools and who were rebels against the system, and they wanted to tear it down. I grew up in the conservative movement, and when I became conservative, I did the University of Chicago thing. I read Edmund Burke and Alexander Hamilton. And people like my friends were like, we were pro-conservative. And conservatism was based on a basic love for the traditions of the country. At the same time I got out of school, there was a group of people I knew at the time who came out of Dartmouth. And they worked at a magazine called the Dartmouth Review. And you will know some of them, Laura Ingraham, who's on Fox, and a guy named Dinesh D'Souza. And they were not pro-conservative, they were anti-left. And I remember in 1985 or so, some editors of the Dartmouth Review, there was a shanty town on Dartmouth's campus to protest apartheid. And the editors of the Dartmouth Review took a sledgehammer to that shanty town in the middle of the night while kids were sleeping inside. I remember being appalled. First, like protesting apartheid, is it like a partisan issue in America? And second, like sledgehammers does not seem very much like Edmund Burke. But they were anti-left, not pro-conservative. And we looked down upon them because we thought their intellectual standards were low. But they took over the conservative movement, and people like me are out. So I think that rebellion is in part because of some resistance to educated classes, not only in the US, but in France, in Italy, in Hungary, all across the Western and even across the globe.
Well, let me ask you, I know you said that you didn't choose the title of that piece, but it sounds like you do think that there is a particular concern about the dynamics in Ivy League institutions, highly selective schools. I noticed that some readers critiqued your argument for its emphasis on the Ivy League, and I want to quote one reader, who's a school teacher in Tennessee, who wrote, "It's a very Ivy League thing to take credit for breaking America." And so I wonder how you respond. Should you focus some on, say, the big flagship public institutions, or is there really a need to focus on this sliver of institutions?
Yeah, it's no fun to attack Penn State. Come on. I would defend that. And it's definitely true that, especially at the New York Times, we overcover the Ivy League and undercover everyone else. That is indisputable. And there are good reasons for that, because all of our reporters are former Harvard Crimson people. But the way I justify it is, it turns out if you control the levers of social mobility at tippy-top places like this one, you have immense cultural impact. And so James Conant, he was only dealing with Harvard. That was his power center. And then there were others at Yale and similar. But within a few years of shifting how they determined who would get into places like this one, it's not only Harvard that changed. American parenting changed. And so there's a great book by Annette Lareau called Unequal Childhoods. And it's about how the educated class radically shifted the way they started raising their kids in the 60s and 70s with this overscheduled, heavy investment in kids. So parenthood changed. The second thing that changed, and that was not nationwide, but it's about the top 60%. Parenting changed. The second thing that changed is that K through 12 education changed. And so suddenly tests and metrics became phenomenally important. The third thing that changed was the job market. To get into a whole range of professions, including my own, somebody likened it to a candelabra. You come from all over the country, you go through these few schools, and then you go to leadership positions across society. And so at the New York Times, at the Wall Street Journal, at the Washington Post, at NBC, at law firms, Hollywood studios, and sector after sector, 55% of the employees went to the same 32 elite schools. And there's a great book called Bottlenecks about how we used to have opportunity pluralism. There were many ways to the top. Now there's one way. And so I think it is true that we overcover the Ivy League. It is also true the cultural power and influence of these admissions committees to set an entire cultural tone for all sorts of Americans, it turns out to be immense. And the good news is, if you can get some of these institutions to change their definition of ability to something which I think would be more humane, then you can also do enormous good. And I think that's beginning to happen. One of the things I learned researching that piece, there is nobody that I interviewed, including at admissions committees all over, who is happy with this system. They feel we were stuck in this system by US News, by all sorts of other legacy forces, and most people would love to see a change. They just can't figure out how to replace it.
Okay, so that piece was very compelling to me, and I'm sure to many members of the audience, and yet you argue that the path forward requires reforming rather than dismantling the meritocracy. I wonder why. If it's so awful, why not dismantle it? Why reform it? And if one is to reform it, what would you do?
Yeah, well, first, I don't believe in dismantling anything. I mean, I became a conservative for a reason. Edmund Burke, who's one of my heroes, he thought change should be constant, but always incremental. And he said you should practice on society the way you would prepare surgery on your father. You should be gentle, non-invasive as possible. And so I don't want to dismantle, because despite my critiques, here I am. These are great institutions. Like it is truly a great pleasure to be here. And I every time I go to the Coop and I go to the Harvard Faculty Authors bookshelf there, I just went there an hour ago. You look at those books, you think, what an amazing place. And the students are electric, and so these are some of the jewels of American life. But I would shift how we admit people here. And I would do that to try to, first of all, to acknowledge the fact that it is impossible to predict somebody's future at age 18. You just can't do it. Life is too varied. Second, but if we do want to select, I would include IQ and SAT and grades. But I'd also, to me, one of the most important factors in anybody's life is determination. And I know a lot of successful people who are smart, and some are not so smart, some are creative, not so creative. I've never met somebody I really admired who's not determined, who just works phenomenally hard. Creativity, social skills, all the wide array of skills that make for a quality human being. And the problem is, these skills are not quantifiable. But guess what? Humans are not quantifiable. And one of the little proposals I had in there, there are schools, high schools across the country who do project-based learning. And the students work in teams, and they do a project together. That is a lot more like life than sitting in a classroom and taking a test alone. And so some of these students graduate from these high schools with a portfolio of projects they worked on over the 4 years. And some of the schools have what they call a portfolio defense, which is like a dissertation defense, where the teachers grill you and say, why'd you make that decision or that decision? And to me, if you could get a narrative about a student, you would learn a lot more than assigning 2 numbers to them. And it would be less scientific, but guess what? The way we're doing it is not particularly scientific either. It just has 2 numbers attached.
Well, let's talk about teaching. One of the most prominent critiques of higher education is that faculty lack intellectual diversity, and some take the argument even further and say that faculty seek to indoctrinate students. Now, I come from the legal tradition where a hallmark of instruction is the adversarial model. And so we assume that students have to learn to argue at least two sides of an issue. And so to the extent that we have a problem, I tend to think of it as about pedagogy. I'd like to invite you to weigh in on this subject. Is the problem pedagogy or ideology or some combination of them?
Well, I think there's a pedagogy, but I was with a colleague at Yale, and he was at a party in New Haven, and he was asked, "What do you do?" And he said, "I teach at Yale." And the other person who asked the question was also on the faculty at Yale, and his response was, "I would never phrase it that way, I teach at Yale." The word teach, that verb, he would not have used that word. And that's like not great. And I'm doing a piece right now for the Atlantic called "What's Going Right with the Universities."
Oh, good.
And I figure I bash them, I might as well say some nice things too. Now, I've been on the phone I was on the phone today with a guy named Roosevelt Montas, who's at Bard, I was at Columbia. And he was a kid, he grew up in the Dominican Republic. He went to Queens, mom moved him to Queens. He spoke little English, but he was in his apartment building. The next door neighbor threw out a book. And Roosevelt, little 12-year-old Roosevelt, picked it up because it was handsome. And it was a book of Socratic dialogues. And he started reading it, and it changed his life. And he went to Columbia, where they do a lot of Socrates. And then he taught at that Columbia program, and now he's teaching it at Bard. And those are, when I see the people, I can always recognize them when they got the pure of the disease, where they just think teaching is the greatest thing you can do as a professor. And I think a lot of professors feel that way. A lot don't. Their discipline and their work is more important. So I think that's part of the problem. I do think there's also a partisanship problem, an ideological problem. And I say that by the time I was going to go to grad school, like my parents, and if people of a certain age will remember a guy named John Anderson who ran for president in 1980. So I was president of the University of Chicago John Anderson for President Committee. And he was a moderate Republican from Illinois, and then, as now, I'm moderate Republican. And I knew there was no future for me in the academy. And I figured even if I got a job, I would go to these campuses and there'd be one conservative. And I didn't want to be the one. I didn't want to be Harvey Mansfield. And as much as I admire Harvey Mansfield. And when I was teaching at Yale, we had one conservative on faculty who was a real professor, not like me, named Donald Kagan, the classicist. And it was in the run-up to the Iraq War, and they had a lot of panel discussions about should we go to war, and it was always 9 progressives and Donald Kagan. And then the next night, 8 progressives and Donald Kagan. Next night, 12 progressives, Donald Kagan. And so I didn't want to be the one. And so it just did not seem, and I have often advised young people, and I have changed that over the last 6 months, but you're going to find it very challenging. And I have a friend, Will Inboden, who's now the provost at the University of Texas, and he was a very skilled historian, and his thesis advisor said, "You got to keep your politics to yourself." And there are so many stories like that. And so there was a study done at Northwestern and Michigan, which I don't think of as ideological hothouses, where the students were asked, do you feel you have to lie on your papers and pretend to be more progressive than you really are in order to get a good grade? And 88% of the students said yes. So the students are onto the game. At Yale, the Yale Daily News just did a study of Yale faculty political donations. And there are 0 members of the Yale faculty who have given to a Republican at any level in the last cycle. So half the country's Republican, or at least voting for Donald Trump. So I think that's a problem. And then the final critique, and I want to say one thing that gets wrong, is that when you hear Donald Trump or Pete Hegseth or Stephen Miller talk about the universities, and they describe it as a bunch of Maoists marching for revolution, that is obviously wrong. And I've spent many years at Chicago and Yale in particular, and there's great passion for ideological diversity and a great passion for argument. But I just read this study today, so I'm going to cite this study I just happened to come across. It's by a political scientist, good political scientist named John Shields, and some other researchers. So there's an open database of curriculums. You can actually count up which books are getting assigned. And one of the books that gets commonly assigned is a very famous book, a very esteemed book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. And that apparently was assigned in 5,400 courses. And so Shields says, and this is not my field, so I'm just reporting what he found. He said it was a very prominent book, did very well respected, well regarded. But he said there are other books by other scholars that take issue with what Michelle Alexander was arguing. And one is by James Foreman, who I think is at Yale Law.
He is.
And Michelle Fartner, and then a guy named John Pfaff. And so Shields decided to see, if you're assigning Alexander, how often are you assigning a book that critiques it? And the Foreman book is assigned in 3.5% of courses, the Fartner in 2%, and the Pfaff book in 2%. And so you'd think if you valued the contribution, and you've got major scholars on two sides of an issue, you'd want to assign both. And so then he said, well, what books are being assigned with the Michelle Alexander book? And they were books by Angela Davis, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Michel Foucault, and Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So that's not exactly both sides. And so while I think a lot of the critiques of the universities are vastly exaggerated, like as just woke heavens, I think that's vastly exaggerated. I do think there's an issue.
Yeah, we just had John Shields here at Radcliffe talking about some of these issues as a part of our Academic Freedom Initiative. Let me talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing here at Harvard to address some of these issues. I had the pleasure of co-chairing Harvard's Open and Korean Constructive Dialogue Working Group. And one of the things that we are seeking to do is to better train faculty to foster discourse and to draw out disagreement and to equip students to engage in constructive dialogue. I gather from your most recent book, How to Know a Person, that you agree that these are important skills, which means that we may have a problem, but it's a problem that we can work on.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Can you say a little bit more about why these are important skills and how you might go about designing a program to address our needs?
Yeah, I mean, I think for several generations, including my own, there are certain skills that were just not taught. Like, I have a dear friend who, his son is here now, who took his own life. And no one ever, when he was going through his depression for 3 years, no one had ever taught me, how do you accompany a person suffering from severe depression? How do you accompany someone who's going through grief? How do you break up with someone without crushing their heart? Some of these skills, like, nobody ever taught me how to end a conversation gracefully. I remember I went to my 5th high school reunion, and in a cocktail party setting, my only move to get out of a conversation was say, I'm going to go to the bar and get a drink. So I had to leave my reunion 20 minutes later because I was so drunk after 20 minutes. I had like 6 drinks in 20 minutes. And so we just haven't taught these skills. And for that book, I asked conversation experts, how do you become a really good conversationalist? And some of the tips I got, I found them very helpful. Like, one is treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. Make it 100% or 0%. Don't try to 60-40 it. Second, be a loud listener. I've got a buddy, when you talk to him, it's like talking to a Pentecostal charismatic church. He's like, yes, yes, amen, amen, preach that. I just love talking to that guy. Another one is don't be a topper. So if you say to me, we had a horrible flight, I was on the tarmac for 2 hours, I'm inclined to say to you, I know what you're going through. I was on a horrible flight. We were on the tarmac for 6 hours. And it sounds like I'm trying to relate to you, but really I'm saying, let's pay less attention to your inferior set of experiences and more to my superior ones. Another one was, and this is across difference, is find the disagreement under the disagreement. This comes out of the Talmudic tradition, that if we're arguing about, say, tax policy, there's probably a philosophical reason we're disagreeing. And so instead of just repeating our arguments, it's let's figure out what's really the core issue here. And that's a more fun conversation to have. And then finally, somebody told me, a consultant, keep the GEM statement at the center, which is if say my brother and I are arguing about our dad's health care, we may disagree about what care he should get, but we both want what's best for our dad. And that thing we agree upon is the GEM statement. If you can keep that at the center, then you preserve the relationship amid disagreement. And these are just basic social skills. And it seems a little late to be teaching social skills at college, but they've got to be taught somewhere, and they're basic. It's just like learning to play tennis or carpentry. They're skills. And if we taught them, we'd be better off.
Well, let's zoom out to talk again about the country at large, because of course, constructive dialogue isn't something that should be, and working on them, confined to the universities. It's really something that we need to work on as a country. And you've written that in order to heal the country, we need to shift from a focus on the self and personal success to relationships and a commitment to others. I wonder if you can talk about what steps we as individuals and as a society would need to take to move in this direction towards a more relational and community-oriented way of being.
Well, some of it is just normal stuff we can do every day. I started a nonprofit in 2017 called Weave, the Social Fabric Project. And we support and celebrate those who are community builders. And it was based on the idea that social distrust is a core problem, but trust is being built at the local level by people we call weavers. And we go into a town, we've been to almost every state now, and we say, who's trusted here? And people start giving us names. And some of the people don't have any affiliation. They're just we met one woman who said, I practice aggressive friendship. And so she meant by that, I'm the person who hosts the July 4th party. I host the Super Bowl party. I mean, she's going to be the one who hosts, and therefore she is trusted in that community. Some people are more self-consciously civic. There's a guy we ran into in Columbia Heights, which is a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. His job was to take the money in the parking garage. But he has a fascination with city zoning rules. So if you've got a problem with the city, you go to the guy in the parking garage and ask him. And everybody in Columbia Heights knows about this guy. He's the guy. And so he's trusted. Some of the cases are brutal. I sat one day with a woman named Sarah, who's in Central Ohio, and she had the worst thing happen to her that could happen to a human being, which was that her husband killed their kids and himself one day. And she came home and described to me the scene. And she decided she was angry. He tried to ruin her life. And she said, I'm going to make a difference in this world. And so she has a foundation that helps families that have suffered crimes, and the foundation cleans up the home so the family doesn't have to clean up the blood. And she has another effort to help women who've suffered domestic violence. She works at a free pharmacy. Her life is altruism. And they're just beautiful lives. I ran into a woman in Chicago, a neighborhood called Englewood, which is right nearby the University of Chicago on the south side. And her name was Aisha Butler. And she was going to move out of Englewood. She had a 9-year-old girl. She was a little concerned about the safety. And as she was moving out, she sees a little girl in a pink dress playing with broken bottles in an empty lot across the street. And she turns to her husband and says, we're not leaving. We're not going to be another family who left this. And so they decided they're staying put. She Googled volunteer in Englewood, and now she runs something called RAGE, which is the big community organization in Englewood. And she's, if you tell the story about Aisha Butler in Chicago, everybody knows Aisha Butler. And so these are people who are rebuilding society from the ground up. And a lot of us are not going to be as heroic, frankly, as Aisha Butler or people like that. But we could do a little more. And my view is that culture changes when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy. And this is the story of the early church. 12 guys, they found a way of life that was attractive to a lot of people, and now there are 1 billion Christians. And we could all be a little more Weaver-like. And I have arguments with my friend Robert Putnam here, and he really is the instructor of what he calls the me, we curve, which is from 1890, when we were a very individualistic society, to 50s and 60s, when we were a little more communal, and now we're back to being very individualistic. And the pattern of American history is just cycles. And I'm given hope, to quote another Harvard guy, the late lamented Samuel Huntington. He wrote a book in 1981, the title of which is kind of boring. I think it was just like American Politics, but the subtitle was The Promise of Disharmony. And he says in this book that he notices this weird pattern in American history that every few decades we seem to go through what he calls a moral convulsion. And he says this is when people get disgusted with established power. People want to burn everything down. Marginalized groups demand inclusion. A passionate generation comes on the scene. There's a new form of communication technology, and there's a lot of turmoil and disruption. And he said this happened in the 1770s with the Revolutionary period, happened in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson, populism, happened in the 1890s when we sort of failed at industrialization, and it happened in the 1960s. And writing in 1981, he says, I don't know if I believe in 60-year cycles, but if the pattern holds sometime around the second decade of the 21st century, America will go through another moral convulsion. And I read this in 2020. I was like, well done, Professor Huntington. And the good news is you come out of them. And if you think about your own personal growth, like I ask people, what made you who you are today? No one ever says, you know, I took this vacation in Hawaii. It was fantastic. That made me who I am today. Like, nobody says that. They talk about a moment of hardship that they came out of with the help of others. And so it's personal growth, I think, is a process of rupture and repair. And I think national growth is a process of rupture and repair. So we have to break, it's like Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You have a cultural paradigm. It sort of works, but it doesn't work for a lot of people. And so they say, we got to tear this down. And so they do it, but then humans are creative, so they come up with something new. And if you were on college campuses in 1968, there were like thousands of bombings on American college campuses in 1968, 69. And yet you go to 1975, everyone's into disco and est and new agey stuff. And like, we repair. I don't know if that was a progress going to the crystals, but it was more peaceful.
Thank you for sharing those stories. On the subject of national repair, I want to ask you about religion. There are lots of questions coming in from the audience, and we also solicited questions from students, and both of those groups are interested in the role of religion. And here's a question both institutionally and in terms of personal frameworks guiding public action in helping America recover.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, going back to Putnam, people who are religious are happier, are more community-oriented than secular people. The evidence suggests it's not faith itself, but it's just, if you're in a congregation, you're in a congregation. And so I do think there's great value. I came to faith in my 50s. And I used to joke that coming to faith in 2013 was like investing in the stock market in 1929. It was not the best moment to do this. But I would say my values didn't change all that much. Because I raised in a Jewish home, I went to a Christian schools, Christian camps, and I already had the biblical metaphysic in my head. I knew the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I knew that, you know, the welcoming the poor and the marginalized. And so I didn't have faith in God, but the values were there. And so I think having those values, you don't need to be religious to have those values. And given how much we religious people talk about being good, you'd think we'd be a lot better than other people. And we're just not. So, and some of the religious people I know are some of the worst people I know. So I don't think there needs to be a religious revival. But I do think, I think it would be nice, personally, I do think there needs to be a cultural shift. And you look at the moments when America went through this period of rupture and repair, that period which Putnam writes about a lot in the 1890s. People forget how brutal it was. There were economic depressions in that era. There was massive political corruption, poverty, urban poverty, lynching, racial terrorism. Horrible. And the way Putnam tells the story, a couple things happened. First, there was a religious revival which entailed a cultural shift. That social Darwinism, which was a very individualistic ethos, which was dominant in the 1860s and 1870s, was replaced by the social gospel movement, which was more communal. And out of the social gospel movement, you get a bunch of civic organizations, including Jane Addams' Settlement House movement in Chicago. You get, within a few years, you get the rise of the Boys and Girls Clubs, the NAACP, the Sierra Club, the early union movement. A lot of people looked around America and they said, all our institutions are designed for a country where we're raising kids on the prairies of Kansas. But we got 1 million kids in Baltimore and Detroit and Cleveland. We need new institutions. And they really got busy and created. And then you had political reform in the progressive era, starting a little later, which also really grew out of the social gospel movement. And so you had this cultural repair, civic repair, and then political repair. And if you look at another case, 1812 to 1848 in Britain, it was the same thing. There was a cultural movement, which was part evangelical, which was anti-slavery, but also the early versions of Victorian morality. And then you had civic revival. There was a movement called the Chartists, for example, sort of a proto-labor movement. And then you had political reform, the Reform Acts and things like that. So if you want to assign a pattern to how nations recover, it would be cultural, civic, political. And now when we're asking politicians to lead the way, and they're worried about their next election, they're not trained to be visionaries. And I think asking Chuck Schumer to come up with a new social vision, it's not fair to Chuck Schumer. And so it's up to people at places like Harvard to come up with a new way to live. And it's up to people in clergy. It's up to all sorts of people. But one of the things you learn is that by the time politics comes along, the politicians are reciting things, ideas that started decades ago. So Donald Trump, who was not the most intellectual politician on earth, believe it or not, he's reciting things that were actually, you could go back to the America First movement back in the 1930s. You could go back to Patrick Buchanan. There was a book by a guy named Christopher Lasch called The Revolt of the Elites, which he wrote in 1995 about how the elites are failing America. You take a listen to J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, and almost everything comes from that book. And I had a young researcher named James about 10 or 15 years ago, and I stopped by his desk at the Times, and I noticed he had Christopher Lasch's book, The Revolt of the Elite, on the desk. I thought, why is James reading a 20-year-old piece of social analysis? Well, James is now J.D. Vance's speechwriter. So, he was persuaded by this book. The elites are really selling America short, and we need a populist movement. And so the power of those ideas, but they build over decades, and they stretch back further than you can think. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. Milton Friedman started the Mont Pelerin Society with Hayek and these other free market economists. I think it was like 1948. Buckley starts National Review in the mid-60s. It just takes time for ideas to translate into a political movement.
Well, there are a number of questions here, now that we've talked about repair, asking you to diagnose the rupture. And this is from a student. I'm anxious about what seems to be persistent economic and social inequality and how this inequality may impact our politics. And here she's asking you whether there's a solution that you think is feasible.
Well, inequality is real. And I would say when I first started, one of the reasons I became a conservative is that I thought the core problem America faced was stagnation. This would have been in the 1980s, and I was covering crime in Chicago, and we just were not as dynamic. And I thought what Reagan and Thatcher did created the dynamism and the restoration of self-confidence that we needed. But you come along to the 1990s and you come along to 2000, stagnation is not our problem. Inequality is our problem. Mm-hmm. And I think it's economic, but also, as I tried to explain, it's also educational. And to me, there are a couple ways to deal with it. One is redistribution, and I support giving money to poor people. But one of the things that the research has found, there was a hope that you gave cash grants, universal basic income, whatever, child tax credits to people below the poverty line, you would improve the life outcomes for the kids in those families. Mm-hmm. And it turns out when you give money to those folks, they benefit. They can afford to eat, they can afford rent, so it's a plus. But it has surprisingly little effect on the life outcomes of the kids. And the explanation is there's a lot more that goes into a life outcome, social mobility, than just money. Mm-hmm. And so Raj Chetty, a lot of things that are really powerful are cross-class friendships. The ability to know somebody who maybe was in the military. I ran into somebody who was career military. He said, it would never have occurred to me to go into the Navy if I hadn't met somebody who was in the Navy. Mm-hmm. Intellectually, he knew, well, there must be naval officers, but it never occurred to me it would be him. But having the act of meeting somebody and seeing a role model and seeing a pathway, that's tremendously powerful. Having fathers in the neighborhood, even if it's not in your own household, having fathers in the neighborhood increases social mobility. Geography is tremendously important, moving to a place where there's growth. And so my preferred action would be anything we can do to enhance social mobility. Mm-hmm. And so one of my heroes I mentioned is Edmund Burke. My other big lodestar is Alexander Hamilton, who's a Puerto Rican hip-hop star from upper northern Manhattan. But to me, what Hamilton represents is that there's a progressive movement that believes in expanding government to enhance equality, and a more libertarian conservative movement in this country which believes in limited government to enhance freedom. But then there's a third tradition that doesn't have a political home, which starts with Hamilton, goes through Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, the Whig Party, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and it believes in limited but energetic government to enhance social mobility. And if you go to the Lincoln administration, you get the land grant college acts, mm-hmm. you get the railroad legislation. Lincoln gave a ton of speeches on banking because he thought it would create a more dynamic economy. And so anything that can enhance social mobility, to me, is the best approach to inequality. Mm-hmm. And if you want inheritance taxes, believe me, I'm with it. But to create a society where there's fluidity, mm-hmm. to me that ameliorates a lot of the wrongs that come with inequality. And as I said, one of the things, our problem is that the upper middle class has locked in right. their kids. And one of the, if I can get a little political here, one of the things that has disappointed me about the Democrats recently is they have taken education and education reform off the front burner. And so what are the states right now, once you control for demographics, that have the best schools? It's Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. And here's a statistic that baffles me, that in Mississippi, 58% of the black kids are reading at grade level. In California, a richer state without a history of segregation, 28% are reading at grade level. What the hell? And so, to me, that doing education reform, Clinton did it, Obama did it, but Joe Biden's wife was a teacher, but it wasn't a central part of the agenda. When Kamala Harris ran, it was not a central part of her agenda. And I'd love to see Democrats get back in the game of school reform. And we've screwed up school reform because it's very hard. But we should be still trying, because frankly, the red states are showing that you can make some big, impressive gains.
Mm-hmm. There are questions about being a moderate. And let me offer this one. How do people with moderate political or social views infiltrate a popular media environment that magnifies conflict and emphasizes extreme opinions?
I feel I've successfully infiltrated the media environment. You know, it is harder because it's really hard to write a column on the one hand, on the other. But if you start, as I do, with the basic idea that most political issues are competitions between partial truths, that they're just inevitable trade-offs in life between freedom and coherence and equality. There are trade-offs. There's a trade-off between diversity and cohesiveness. There are trade-offs between equality and achievement. And there's no final solution to these trade-offs. You're just trying to get the right balance at the moment. And so it's always a process of negotiation between goods. And if you see politics that way, then it's really hard to see the other side as equal, because they have a piece of the truth and you have a piece of the truth. And so I've been greatly influenced by Isaiah Berlin, a British philosopher, who believed in pluralism, that values do not fit together. That we would like to think that everything would neatly fit together and you could have some perfect definition of what a good society looks like, but they just don't. And so you have to accept that values are plural and that you're just negotiating. And Berlin ended his life by saying, I'm content to be on the rightward edge of the leftward tendency. And that's where I find myself. I used to be a Republican, but I can't be that anymore. So I'm really a Whig. Like there are 6 of us, but but I'm content to be a conservative Democrat. But I cling to that word conservative because I think Edmund Burke and Hamilton. I went back and after all the Trump mishigas, that's Yiddish for whatever. I went back and remembered all the books I read after I became more conservative after my experiences in Chicago, and read the old books that I read as a young man to really introduce myself to the movement. And I loved them all over again. And one of the things that I loved about them was that, to me, conservatism, both our political tendencies, our major ones, begin with the Wars of Revolution, the 17th century, the Wars of Religion. And you get to the middle of the 18th century and people say, enough. Because those wars were bloodthirsty. People said, we're not going to do this anymore. And so one group of people in France said, we're going to replace religious strife with the power of reason. And we're going to have the Temple of Reason, the French Revolution, and I think progressivism has descended from that. We're going to use reason to build a better society. Another group of people, who are mostly centered in Scotland, said, no, reason is weak. We don't trust reason. We trust the sentiments when well educated. And the word they used was sentiments. We would say the emotions or passions. And their view was that the emotions and passions, when well educated by manners, by tradition, by education, they are actually fine, valuing instruments that you can guide your life by. And I'm with them. David Hume famously said, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, when well educated. And conservatives like Edmund Burke, he had a sentence, I think I put it in my final column, manners are more important than laws. The law touches us but here or there, now and then. But manners, by which he meant culture, is with us every second of every day. How we react, how we see, how we perceive, how we feel. And so he thought it was just tremendously important to have a healthy culture to train the passions so they would assign value to things properly. And so I'm part of that tradition. And it's a source of great solace to me that I'm part of a conservative tradition that just happens to have nothing to do with the people who currently call themselves conservatives in American politics.
There are questions about your thoughts on the future of globalization and the immigration crisis.
Well, another reason why global populism is everywhere is the immigration crisis. And, you know, I tried over the course of the last 20 years to write a column saying, you know, the people who really want to restrict immigration have a point. And I looked for economic evidence that they have a point, like it's really hurting wages for native-born Americans. Didn't really find much. I don't think they have a point about American culture. I mean, I love the Bad Bunny. I was literally like, A, it was a good show, but B, good for us.
Yeah.
Like, how many countries can have the major theatrical event of their year not in the primary language of the country? It's like, yeah, that's an act of cultural self-confidence. And it was great. And so I could never write that column because nonetheless, you do have to have a sense that there's some sense of control at the border, that the laws are being followed. And the Biden administration screwed that up big time for reasons that New York Times has reported on. And it just remains a fact that if you're in a part of the country where there are no jobs, all the young people are leaving, and you see a lot of people just walking across the border, people are going to draw a conclusion. And so obviously if we're going to treasure immigration, it really has to be controlled immigration. And we sort of lost the ball on that one. And so, but I'm still remain pro-globalization, pro-immigration. I'm like 1990s guy. And I just think the free flow of people and ideas, and if you look at the history of civilizations that are at their peak, there's a guy, Robert Hall, I can't remember, I won't cite him because I can't remember his name, who looked at great civilizations. They're places where people come together. They're places of globalization. That's Venice, it's Amsterdam, it's London. And now it's Beijing, I guess. But I still think that's the right future. But we took something really good, and we did not understand who was being hurt by something that was primarily good, which was less educated workers in the industrialized world. But I would still point out that in the last 50 years, we've seen the greatest reduction in world poverty in world history. Income inequality is wider here than before, but global inequality is heavily down because you have developments across Asia, across Africa. There's been a lot of good that's been produced over the last 50 years of globalization. And if you don't like the American-led world liberal international order, wait till you see what comes next. And the one thing this is one troubling thing, and this is a question in my mind. I was interviewing, the New York Times has this summit called the Deal Book Summit. And I was interviewing 6 CEOs from PayPal, Southwest Airlines, KSG, the pharmaceutical firm, a couple others, Mattel. And I said, China is eating our lunch in industry after industry, like EVs, solar panels. They're quite competitive in AI. My mentor, Milton Friedman, would not have said this was possible. Have we chosen the wrong system? And instead of them coming back with the Chamber of Commerce answer, it was like they really can devote resources the way we can't. They can think long-term like we can't. And so we should take a look at the success of China and wonder, is that real? Is that sustainable? Do we have to rethink our system? I'm open to rethinking that. Just you can't ignore the rise of what China's doing. And then the final thing I'll say, I've really been struck over the last 2 weeks by how the conversation about AI has changed. I'm on Claude Opus 4.6, whatever it is. And in the sort of stuff I write about, I don't know if you use it in your work, like sociology, psychology, the early versions, the early models were terrible. They were just hoovering up random stuff on the internet, and it was bland, pablum. Now you ask a good question to a 4.6, you get a real answer. And so that's what's happened in the last 2 weeks. I think it's been eye-popping for a lot of people.
Well, there's a question here soliciting your thoughts on AI, specifically on human relationships, creativity, and critical thinking.
Yeah, my fear, well, first, a lot of people use AI as their friend.
Yeah.
And that's terrifying. I am a big believer that we are embodied mammals, and that our emotions and the cortisol, the testosterone, all the stuff that's flowing through us, that's part of human relationships. And if you reduce a human being to a brain on a stick, then you're leaving out the real person. I highly recommend a book, by the way, called The Hour Between Wolf and Dog by a neuroscientist named John Coates, who was a trader, a stock trader before he became a neuroscientist. And he noticed he was riding one of those bubbles, and when you're in the bubble, especially if you're a guy, your testosterone is surging. You're like, every sense of risk goes away. It's like certainty, like this is rolling, let's invest, throw it in. And he noticed that some traders could recognize bubbles. And the traders who could recognize a bubble were really good at monitoring their own heart rates. They were aware, oh, my heart is racing right now. And they said, something's out of control, I gotta get out. And so his thesis is that, and one of the things that a lot of people who know more about neuroscience than I do is, it's really a mistake to separate a brain from a body. They're part of one system. And you're thinking a lot with your guts. And if you reduce it to a simulation of emotion, then that's just awful, and that's not a real relationship. We're just feeding people to something horrible. As for my fear about AI, and I'm generally an optimist, I just think it's a new form of intelligence that we can harness. But my fear is that, pick a number, 10%, 20% of humans like to think. And they will use AI to think more. And a large majority of humans are cognitive misers. Thinking is painful. And they will use AI to think less. And so we will get a kind of inequality that is not only income inequality, or cultural or educational, but is literally cognitive inequality. And that is a scary prospect.
Well, let me ask you one final question, and it is from an audience member watching from Europe who says, beautiful talk. Let's also stop on the good. And the question is, what is a strength of the American social fabric that can be celebrated and even adopted as a model in other contexts?
Yeah, I think there's somebody who came here in like 1912 and wrote a book about the American culture. And the first sentence of that book, I think it was a Dutch guy, said, everybody recognizes the ultimate trait of America is energy. And I think that traditionally has been us. That especially people who immigrated here, they came here in, say, the 17th century, and they saw flocks of geese so big that it took them 45 minutes to take off. They saw forests going on forever. They saw abundance. And two thoughts crossed their minds, these people who lived around here, the Europeans anyway, that God's plan for humanity could be completed here, and that we could get really rich in the process. And so, in my view, America's always been fired by a moral materialism. Chesterton famously said, we're a country with the soul of a church. Luigi Barzini, an Italian, said, Americans they look materialistic, but they're driven by a spiritual wind. Crèvecoeur, a French guy, came over to fight in the French Indian War, and he settled in New York State. And he said, a funny thing, when a European comes here, it used to be that walking 10 miles seemed like a vast different distance. But once you live here for a while, walking 250 miles doesn't seem very far. There was a novel, I've forgotten the name, I think it was called Giants of the Earth, written by a Scandinavian writer who settled in North or South Dakota, one of those. And in the novel, he has the farmer is showing a guest to his farm. And he says, well, here's where the barn is, and here's where the beautiful home is, and here are the fields. And the visitor says, I don't see anything. You haven't built anything here. And the farmer says, well, I haven't built it yet, but it's here. And so I've always thought I think Whitman said, the nation of futurity, that we see the present through the vantage point of our shared future. We don't have a shared past, but we have a shared future. And that used to make us, there was a guy named Seymour Martin Lipset who wrote about American exceptionalism. And he didn't mean better, he just meant different. And he said Americans move more, they start companies more, they kill each other more, they marry and divorce more, they're just a lot of energy. And I would hate to see that go away. And the good news is that I think that's deep in our cultural DNA. We are still Tocqueville's country. And the better news, to end on a really hopeful note, is that I have a friend who's an economist, and he says, take all the problems of America and list them on the left side of a legal pad. And then on the right side of the legal pad, write, America has more talent than ever before. You think about how bad we were at marshaling talent through most of American history and still to some degree today. All the groups whose talents were excluded or not developed. All the immigrants who didn't come here. Now we're doing a little better. And so America has more talent than ever before. And so that gives me hope that we've got the most important resource. And after bashing James Conant for the first half hour, I give him some credit.
Thank you. What a wonderful way to end. That was really fantastic. Thank you so much for your thought-provoking conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining us today and for your questions. I hope to see you again soon. You can find a recording of today's event on our website and more information about Radcliffe's upcoming programming. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thanks so much.